everyone, so today we're going to talk about why you're not required to get the booster, nor any other injection for that matter, and ways you can avoid getting one. So today we're mainly going to focus on how to avoid getting one, but we'll briefly go over why. So I've talked about this many times before, but I might as well do a brief overview. So first of all, they are still in clinical trials. I've done an extensive overview in another video, but it is not legal or ethical to require anyone to take a medical intervention that is still in clinical trials. So we have research principles that govern this. One is called the Nuremberg Code, and the other one is called the Declaration of Helsinki. And to just briefly overview that, we cannot legally force anyone to take anything, especially anything in clinical trials, under duress or coercion, and there are serious penalties for that. So the reality is what you see going on is not quite legal, but unfortunately it's still happening anyway. But you do have rights, and you don't have to take anything that is in a clinical trial. The second thing is that it is your body, so therefore it is your choice. So if you don't feel comfortable with taking something or putting something in your body, you have the right to say no or refuse a medical treatment without the fear of reprisal. That is also outlined in the Nuremberg Code as well as the Declaration of Helsinki. The third thing is that all risk of the medical procedure is assumed by you as a recipient, which I also reviewed earlier. But therefore, you should be the one, and you are the one who decides whether this is the right approach for you. And the fourth reason why is that the law protects you. The law protects your rights to change your mind and your freedom to exercise your religion. So to clarify, the law doesn't give you rights, nor does the government give you rights. You already have these rights. You were born with these rights. However, the laws are there to make sure that governments stay in line and obey what your rights are, but unfortunately this is not happening. But some examples of those are the First Amendment, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and 42 U.S. Code, Section 2000A, etc., etc. So those are a couple of examples of some things that govern or protect your rights, rather. So essentially, if you have gotten, shot 1 or shot 2, but if you decide that you don't want 3, 4, 5, 6, or any of the other ones that are coming, you have the right to say no. You can say no. But how exactly do you go about saying no? And so for some of us, we might be in a tricky situation because the deadlines might have passed for religious exemptions, and now we're hearing about a booster that is required for those who have already taken shots 1 and 2. So this is some uncharted territory. So of course what I say is not legal advice because I'm not a lawyer. But there is, where there's a will, there's a way, right? And so I imagine this is an area where a lot of, litigation will happen, and we'll see a lot more of, the legal aspects and, lawyers stepping out and giving people recommendations for those who don't want to go for 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I will be outlining a few steps that you can take if you decide that the booster isn't for you. Of course, with anything I say, make sure you carefully vet it. Don't just go doing anything. Make sure you consult your personal situation, and make sure that you consult God, which goes into step 1. So the first thing that I'd recommend that you do is pray and ask God for wisdom and how to approach your personal situation. So everyone's situation is very different and therefore requires a different approach, right? So you want to make sure that you are hearing from God and being led by Him before making any decision, or before, taking any advice. The second thing is mask non-compliance. So and this is, of course, a more idealistic approach, but these mandates and requirements are only successful if everyone agrees to them. Right? So, for example, because some schools and workplaces have gotten the majority of people on board the first time around, it's much easier to do this the second time around. So therefore, as I've been speaking about before, if you continue to comply, it will not end because there will always be one more booster. And I've shown, in previous in a previous post that there are plans for number 4 already, even though many people haven't received number 3. And it's possible that number 5 will be coming by next year, right? So even if 40 to 50% of those in the schools or workplaces refuse to go along with it, it can't be enforced because the schools or workplaces can't function without 40 to 50% of people who refuse to take it, right? So there are a growing number of companies where this was successful at suspending the mandates due to labor shortages. So therefore, you as a people, you do have power, but you have to take the power in your hands and not just go along with whatever you're told. However, I would admit that this method is idealistic, and it depends on the culture of your school and workplace. So if most people are just going to go along with it, regardless, this method would be very challenging to implement, right? So the next thing is to stand regardless of what happens or what other people choose to do. Most likely, mass non-compliance will not happen because this is the culture and a lot of people are afraid. However, if you have consulted God and God convinces you that you should not, or convicts you rather, that the booster is not for you, stand by that conviction and ask God to make a way for you. So getting an exemption for this, I would say, there's a possibility, and you only really know if you ask, right? So I will be putting resources for exemptions, legal aid, etc., in the comments, as I usually do. But it might be more challenging. But I don't believe that it is impossible. Again, we are going through very uncharted territory, but someone needs to lay the groundwork. So I'd say to reach out to those who have been successful with getting exemptions, Exemption Resources, for example, Liberty and Health Alliance, The Healthy American by Peggy Hall, or I am Kate Corrigan. So this is all one word. So I'll spell out her name. It's CaitCorrigan. So this is on Instagram. And also, you can consider reaching out to your school or job to let them know your situation and know what your options are. Because, of course, if you don't ask, you'll never know. So remember that your body does not belong to the government, your school, your job, your employer. Your body belongs to God. And at the end of your life, you are accountable for the choices that you make in your body or how you have chosen to steward over your body. According to Romans 12, verse 1, we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, and not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, so we can follow the will of God. So whatever you choose to put in your body is very much a religious matter. And it begins, believe it or not, in the mind, right? Because what we see right now is not just a physical, but an ideological and spiritual battle. As the Word of God says, we ought to obey God rather than man. And we can find that in Acts 5, verses 29. So to close, I'd like to turn your attention to Daniel 1. And many of us know this story because it's the story of the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are known by their real Hebrew names as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar when he was in Babylon. So there are a few important aspects that I want to point out, and I'll leave you with that. But the first one is a king appointed, or another way you can think about this is mandated, a health intervention. He assigned everyone the same diet for their health, and you can find this in Daniel 1 verse 5. Daniel purposes in his heart to not defile himself with the king's meat or wine. He requests from the prince of the eunuchs that he may not defile himself. Daniel requests an exemption from the health mandates, and you can find this in Daniel 1 verse 8. God gives Daniel favor because Daniel had upright conduct and was in right relationship with God. God prepares the way before Daniel asks. And you can see that in Daniel 1 verse 9, because it says that he had tender love and favor with one of the king's officials. So there was a fear that if Daniel did not accept the health intervention, Daniel would be less healthy than those who had accepted the standard government health intervention. Essentially, Daniel was not only risking his health, but his life, because disobedience to the king carried the death penalty. And you can find that in Daniel 1 verse 10. God came through for Daniel. Daniel ended up eating a plant-based diet and drinking water, which was against the king's commands. But because Daniel stood for God, God stood for Daniel. Daniel and the friends that stood with him ended up being healthier than those who obeyed the king's commands. And he received spiritual blessings and promotions that were not received by the others, which is Daniel 11 through 21, the rest of the chapter. And I mean, what's interesting to know is that we really don't hear about the rest of the others, and there were probably millions taken, but these are the only 3 or 4 people, rather, that we hear of. And the last point is that because Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys stood up during a health crisis, they were able to stand during a religious crisis. And this does make sense because, if we practice standing during, let's say, easier trials, it's easier to stand during more difficult trials. But if we're used to compromising during easier trials, it's going to be more difficult to stand during more difficult trials, right? In Daniel 3, the 3 Hebrew boys were tested again to bow before a statue or an idol under the penalty of death. Almost everyone bowed down except for the 3 Hebrew boys. So we notice the same people who were standing during the health crisis were the same people who were standing during the religious crisis. So because they stood for God, they were thrown into the fire, but they were not burned because Jesus was in the midst of the fire. So to close, again, I don't have all the answers because I'm only human, but I know a God who does. Ultimately, what you choose to put into your body is a personal decision between you and God, and it should remain that way. It's not, government's business, and we certainly don't need, injection passports for this. So if you consult God and He tells you to get the booster, by all means, get the booster. However, if He convicts you not to get the booster, know that God can make a way even though it seems impossible. So He may not deliver in the way you think or you envision, but God will be faithful to deliver you. So whatever you choose to do, know that you should trust God, regardless of what that is. Know that you're not alone, and there are those out there with you that are going through, something similar as well. And make sure that whatever decision you make, it's in line with what God wants you to do. And with that, I'll end. But thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.